Well, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Jen Bachner and I direct the Master of Science in Government Analytics program here at Johns Hopkins, and we're very excited that you're joining us this morning. We host this breakfast about every other month along with REI Systems, and the purpose is to talk about how analytics are being used in the public sector, some of the challenges, some of the successes that we're having. Typically our speaker presents, but I think today it'll be more of a discussion, so we very much encourage audience participation, both those of you who are sitting here in the room as well as those who are online. You can enter your questions into the chat box that's below the video. Our speaker, I think, will offer some comments for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up and have a great discussion. We encourage you to tweet about the forum using the hashtag #GabForum. And note that a recording of the event will be posted both to the REI website and to the Hopkins website 24 to 48 hours afterwards. So you're very welcome to share this event and the recording with your colleagues. We appreciate that. I think that's all the logistics and announcements. So thank you again for joining us, and I will let Jeff from REI Systems introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Let me first, though, emphasize the purpose of these events is to build a community around government analytics, and to a large degree to give each of you a chance to kind of have a community you can turn to if you face a tough problem and you're not quite sure how to solve it, or if you want to kind of learn from someone that you've seen be very successful. A lot of what we try and do is identify speakers who've been really successful in one domain or another, one sort of government activity or another, and invite them here to share with you how they succeeded. But it's also bluntly to give you an opportunity to meet each other so that you can kind of, again, have that network that's strengthened, learn new techniques, kind of keep at the cutting edge, the leading edge of your game, and improve government's performance through data and analytics. So please, I hope if you haven't already, meet some of the folks who are around you and take a little bit of time to kind of form and strengthen your network. We like to do this because my company, REI Systems, is involved in government analytics, and we often do data management as well as data presentation, data gathering, develop data analytics models for a wide variety of government agencies. So we are here to help if you need help, but a lot of what we're interested in, again, is strengthening the community where you can rely on each other as well. I want to emphasize that I've worked with Patty Cogswell for almost 20 years on and off now, and she is, I think, one of the most astute consumers of analytics that I've met in all of government. And I find this very interesting because kind of my purpose in suggesting that she come is to give you all a perspective of what does a very senior executive want as a consumer of analytics? What types of information, what types of models, what types of ways to communicate it? And the bonus is that not only is she a very senior executive, but she's also kind of been in the trenches as well. So she kind of knows what things are like from your perspective and knows what things are like now at the very top levels of government. In addition, Patty's had actually a very illustrious career, moving from Citizenship and Immigration Services, where I first worked with her, to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And of course, the first is kind of benefit processing and trying to make sure that the very complex set of immigration laws are appropriately administered. The second was, of course, a law enforcement activity with respect to immigration and enforcing our immigration laws. And now, she's over the last couple of years been the Deputy Administrator, Acting Deputy Administrator at the Transportation Security Administration in an operating role. And that led me to think she probably has some constructive experience and ideas to offer you about how do agencies interact, how and when and where can they share data. And the caveat is that some of you may be aware, but over the last couple of months, Johns Hopkins University and REI Systems collaborated to conduct a survey of government analytics. And essentially, we surveyed a bunch of government analytics professionals to find out what had been their successes, what had been their challenges, what did they see as some of the major problems. One of the most significant problems they identified was they spend more of their time than any other activity gathering data. And as we had some discussions 2 months ago in this room, one of the things they suggested was, well, it would be great if I didn't have to gather the data all from their original sources, because I know another agency has it. If I could only access that other agency's data, if I'm only aware it existed, and we could share it efficiently without a 2-year process to negotiate an MOU, that would really save a lot of my time. And instead of gathering the data, my rocket scientists could spend time analyzing the data and recommending appropriate action and improving government performance. And so I thought that kind of Patty's experience moving across a variety of government agencies and again interacting outside the Department of Homeland Security would help give you some insight as to kind of how is it that, what are some of the key challenges, but also what are some of the key opportunities to improve the way that government agencies do share data. So with that, what we're going to do is Patty's agreed that she'll be happy to answer questions as we go. She's going to have kind of a few opening remarks and comments, and we hope that you all will feel free to ask questions as you go. We do ask that you identify yourself as you ask the questions, and a number of the questions, of course, will come from folks in the room. There will be others from folks who may be participating via live stream over the internet. We hope you folks will be interested and willing to ask questions as well. So with that, thank you very much for joining us, Patty. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. We decided to be very informal here, so we'll see if it throws everybody off to have everybody sitting behind the table, but it seemed I didn't feel the need to be behind a podium. So while Jeff hit a lot of the high points of my original career, I thought I might spend just 2 minutes, given some of the audience interest, talking about how did I even start out in this space in the first place. So my undergraduate degree is in math. Really always liked and enjoyed working on hard problem sets, dealing with how do I get information out, how do I decide what this information is good for, but came to the conclusion towards the end of my math program that I was not going to enjoy jobs that were purely in the math sphere. So I went to law school, because these things go together. The great thing that law school teaches you is a complete lack of fear about writing in any way, shape, or form, because you write so often on so many things in a completely factual or persuasive way that you can just write very, very quickly. But I came to the end of coming towards the end of my law school career and said, yeah, I don't think I want to practice law either. So all this is to start out by saying, what do you do when you have capability and skills in analytics of data and information, and the ability to write? You can work for the government. So, no, I'm just saying, this is an area where there's a lot of jobs, a lot of interest. The fact that you can do these two skills is probably one of the most sought after combination skill sets there still are, because you can do almost anything. And I will say, I also point this out to make the point of, if you are an undergraduate and don't know what you want to do at the end of with the rest of your life, that's more than okay. I honestly at one point thought I was going to be a research chemist. That clearly didn't happen. So it's okay to change your mind a number of times along the way and just be open to, that sounds like a cool thing to work on. That sounds like a fun project. I'd like to learn more about that and see where it leads you. All right, so with that, I'm going to spend a bit of time. So that's how I got into government originally, as Jeff noted, back at the Immigration and Naturalization Service, so pre-Department of Homeland Security. We may have been together on 9/11.
Pretty close.
Yeah. But since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, I'm on my 9th role. I have worked in 3 different components, as Jeff highlighted, 3 different parts of headquarters, and did a stint at the National Security Council of almost 3 years. I have worked on almost everything DHS has in terms of content. I have enjoyed every bit of it because it really helps see overall the totality of where there are opportunities to cross-link initiatives, authorities to take on very hard problems. So with that, I want to spend 2 minutes talking a little bit about the TSA environment to kind of help level set some areas that maybe hopefully will be useful for conversation. So the first part is, I'm just going to take a quick survey. Other than you, don't cheat. How many of you think you know what TSA does? 1, and he used to work for us, so he doesn't count 2. Yeah, all right, so number 1 thing people think about is the blue-shirted folks who stand at the front of the security checkpoint at the airport, right? Yeah, so while that is the majority of the people we have employed, that is not our entire mission. So we own and operate the checkpoint, but we actually regulate the airport writ large, air cargo, and surface transportation. So over-the-road buses, freight and passenger rail, mass transit, pipelines. Yes. Did any of that surprise you? Good, okay. So So that's a starting place. Next one is when you think about all of that, that's a lot of stuff, right? That's a big environment. We obviously can't do all of it either the same way or at the same level. So critically important for us is to have an analytic framework that looks at what are threats, what are vulnerabilities, and what is the risk. So risk, of course, is a combination of threat, vulnerability, consequence, right? As in, I have this threat, I have a vulnerability, but even if it happens, 2 people will just have to spend an extra hour. That's a very low risk. However, depends on what the threats and vulnerabilities are. Sometimes, even if the consequence isn't very big, you still say, I need to take on that threat, I need to take on that vulnerability. So understanding that framework as a starting place to help determine what do I go after and why do I go after it is critically important. So that's my number 1 data problem. My next data problem is, great, I decided what a threat is, I decided what a vulnerability is, I decided what risk is, and risk can be both here in the United States to something we own or operate, or at a last point of departure, an airport that flies to the United States, which we also assess. But then I say, what's the mitigation that I might choose to try to reduce that threat or vulnerability? I can spend a lot of money and take my risk down like this. It doesn't do me any good. I can do a very small mitigation that has a very big impact on the threat or vulnerability. So understanding again, what is my data telling me about the impact of taking an action is absolutely critical. First myth-buster thing I want to do. Do you think we need to actually get our risk to 0? Correct. He said no. I would add to this is, I also don't have to have my vulnerability to 0. I don't have to have a mitigation that is 100% effective all the time. And why do you think this is? Because if you look at who is trying to attack us and how they're trying to attack us, they're going to go for whatever they think is the easiest thing. So if something's harder, they're not going to go for that, right? They're going to go say, what's the next thing I should look at, the next vulnerability, the next mechanism. And sometimes that's, the US is too hard, I'm going to go try someplace else. The third piece I want to talk about, continuing in the myth-busting range, I hope the myth-busting range, is testing. So unlike many environments, so obviously a lot of places do something similar to what we do at the checkpoint, right? Scan your carry-on materials, scan you, ask for identification in some kind of way, shape, or form. Not everybody tests their system to see how effective they are. We do our own testing that's pretty significant. We also do testing with DHS Science and Technology. We have the Inspector General who likes to test us on a pretty regular basis. And the important part is to understand the different types of testing, what it's telling you, and how to use it. All right, want to make a guess on how many times the public or Congress knows how to use those data results right? Yeah, not great. But in general, there's kind of 3 buckets of testing, and I'll expand on that a little bit. One is overt, right? The person knows they're being tested and the tester knows they're testing somebody. The second one is covert. The tester is intentionally seeking to get through a system. The person who's being tested doesn't know they're being tested. The third one is double blind. So both the person doesn't know they're being tested, and while the tester may know he's testing something, he doesn't in fact know at that moment in time, for example, is he actually carrying a prohibited item through a checkpoint or not? Right? And that's important because that lets us identify and break out the data with respect to, did something about the manner of the tester tip somebody off, right? So the other piece that goes along with it is it a known material and our system is built to find it? right? And some of that goes to if you know you're being tested and it's on something your system is being built to, we should do really well on those, right? Because that is what we built the system to do. That's what they've been trained on. That is how they should know how to do it. What if it's a brand new threat that the system was never designed to identify and you've never been trained on it? Right. The whole point is that you aren't going to do well on that. If you do, it's like, cool, how did that happen? What made that work? What tipped them off? Because our system isn't even designed to find it. And then the third piece is, and this is why it's so incredibly important to design your testing correctly and understand your data, is where someone's intentionally targeting the process to highlight a known capability gap. And I consider these a little unfair, right? It's like, if you know, and we know, machine won't find X, I don't really need another 5 tests telling me I'm not going to find it. I already told you that. I've already probably sent to Congress a request for some additional technology or something to close the gap. So you proving it again doesn't really help me or tell me, as opposed to other types of testing. And I'll give one example that we're working on right now. We call it index testing. So index testing, the key out of that is that you do so many tests, and these are all covert tests. So many tests, you can actually have enough things get through at each stage that you can actually say, how good am I at this stage? How good am I at this stage? What happens at this stage? What's my end result? And this is incredibly valuable because that lets us tell us, this one's already at 85%. Your incremental value to get higher than that is very expensive. But over here, you're only, pick a number, 30%. You could make a big improvement over here and really increase your overall effectiveness. That's critically important for us in terms of data. The other piece that goes along with this is explaining to people what is good enough. So back again to context, right? Context of what does this result mean? So when someone says at an open hearing, and by the way, these are things you never want to hear as a witness in open hearing, didn't the IG find that they got through X number of materials or X percentage? And you're really going, this is not what I want to be telegraphing to our adversaries. And you have to try to put in context, this was a test against a known vulnerability that we have told you about that exists, and we have told you what equipment we need to buy to fix it. So me telling you again is not helping, right? So why is my message about what this is good for or not good for not getting through? But the other piece of it is, back again to the underlying issue, I don't need to be at 100%. I don't need to find absolutely everything all the time. But what's the good enough number that is palatable to our oversight? All right, one last thing that goes along with this, right? It keeps going on this discussion. So not only do I have to figure out a way to communicate what all this data means and the context around it, and why 100% is not the goal, but I also have to figure out a way to measure and value deterrence. I am constantly on the lookout for someone who has figured out how to explain a decent measure on deterrence. What data do you use? Do I look at Intel reporting and see if they're talking about our security measures? Sure. Guess how often that happens? More often than you think, maybe, but not enough to give you a really good representative sample size that actually gives you meaningful statistics. So how do I find a proxy measure that tells me I've put enough into this, I can go on to the next thing because they've already decided X is too hard. Okay. The next thing I need to do is have a real important conversation of, all right, I've identified a threat or a vulnerability. How quickly do I need to close the gap? Why is this important? Because I can take really harsh measures to close something if I think it is absolutely imminent. So the one that most people think of is a couple years ago when suddenly you couldn't carry personal electronic devices onto a plane. There was very credible intelligence information that was very, very scary, which is why we had to take a very hard measure. It wasn't necessarily the best way to permanently close that gap, right? The best way to close that gap is better designed ability to detect, some additional work on how do we find the person who is helping perpetrate what this threat is, a lot of other options. But we had to do something right then because of the potential imminence associated with it. I couldn't wait until the technology that was better at finding it could actually be deployed. There are other times we can wait, right? Why is this important? Because you have to also understand, is your mitigation measure, not only is it effective, is it the right thing, but how sustainable is it? If I tell 25 countries that they need to hand go through everyone's luggage because they don't have really good x-ray machines, how well a job do you think they're going to be doing after 3-4 years? Right. Yeah. So this is the other piece that you have to understand data of around your mitigation measures and your ability to close that gap. All right, I threw out a lot of stuff there. I hope that piques your interest on some of the ways that data is incredibly meaningful to me on a regular basis, because this is how we decide our priorities, and this is how we decide what we ask for in budget quite often, right? Is the ability to understand where are those risks, vulnerabilities, threats, how effective are the mitigation measures that are available, where do I need to do research, all of that comes from this type of analytics.
Let me ask the first question and then invite the audience. One of the things that clearly you're using the analytics to do, as you suggest in the kind of the open congressional hearing with the IG and then the Congress not having given you money to close a gap and now criticizing you. An analytic wonk, to a certain extent like me, like you, often needs to be able to persuade a layperson like Congress to take some sort of action. And we kind of think, maybe they're rational decision makers. Maybe some evidence will persuade them. And you're kind of illustrating that not always. So my question is, how and when do you decide and kind of with what audiences, what kind of data to bring to them to try and persuade? And can you tell us any anecdotes about when you brought something other than data that's really been persuasive?
So I think the number one thing that we do with members of Congress to help break through all this is actually classified briefings. Because the ability for me to share certain types of information in those open hearings and those open forums, it's going to be extremely difficult for me to have persuasive enough information to fully make the sales pitch there.
What that kind of tells me, though, is it's actually not the large data and the trends, it's the individual anecdotes that you can't share in an open briefing. And what I try and draw, and I want to check this with you, what I try and draw as the analogy is someone in some other agency that's not within the security community, let's pretend the Department of Labor or Department of NIH. I remember I talked with one of you earlier that was from NIH. It may be that you want to kind of identify some anecdotes that are hopefully kind of relevant to the trend, and then sit down if you can get attention from the decision maker, whether it be a senior executive or political appointee or whomever, and kind of explain the anecdotes as an illustration of the trend. Would you say that's a good analogy for someone outside the security community?
I will say it is incredibly valuable to have good anecdotes, stories, analysis. It's also actually important for me to be able to compare and contrast levels of risk and threat. So if I have a member of Congress who thinks bridges, moving pipeline, and they only care about that, I need to explain why my next dollar isn't going there and is going to something else. And I don't obviously want to have a conversation in public about, we decided not to invest in anything on X, right? That's just not going to happen. But in a closed forum, I can have, or my other personal favorite, again, it's not it as an example, I did a briefing for them not all that long ago where I talked about last points of departure and how we do the various reviews, compliance assessments, the data we gather to help inform that discussion about who's got the highest threat, which they may have very good overall security measures. They're just in a high threat area, right? Someone who's got vulnerabilities, but may be a very low threat around their space, but they just, aren't taking aviation security seriously the way we want them to, and who's got overall risk. I don't think we ever would want to be in a place that publicly I'm diming out which airports fall into which category, right? But to your point, in that space, I can have that. So it's still trend data a little bit more, but yes.
Okay. Questions from the audience? I have dozens, but if you all have some, please. I see you back there.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Adam. I'm a student in the Government Analytics program. Thank you so much. I wanted to hear from you and your perspective. You talked about the first top data threat that you have at TSA, kind of understanding what the overall threat is and how they compare. Given all the different modes of transportation that TSA evaluates, do you have a single model or framework that you use to compare threat across? And if so, how do you review that, and how often do you review it to make sure that it's still valid over time?
Yes, so we have two primary tools. We call them tools. It's analytic processes, and I'm going to mess up what my acronyms stand for, but it's TISRA and RITSPA. So obviously the T and the S are transportation security. I believe R is risk. So, you know, they look at things in slightly different ways. One is across all modes, and then one is very specific drill down within that mode and within that modality, right? So that's where you can look at the end-to-end of a process because you have enough data where you've measured and understand what your risk is at each stage, as opposed to comparing overall threats, overall vulnerability, overall risk. These models both get reviewed on a very regular basis. We have a quarterly risk board that meets, that looks at updated data in those contexts. We take in data both from our direct, compliance information, new threat information as it comes out, recent visits somebody has had, information from the actual operators of the transportation mode, as well as recent results from the Inspector General or anything else, yes. I will say we are in a very interesting space in terms of, because we don't own or operate any of the infrastructure we're talking about, we are constantly in an environment of getting data from whoever it is and saying, what do you need to collect already as part of your regular business? Can you share some of it with us to help improve our model?
I wanted to follow up on that, and I'm curious about getting into the weeds a little bit, your sort of internal process for how your analysts communicate with you. Mm-hmm. Do they present you with lots of tables so that you have all of this information summarized? Do they present visualizations, short memos, presentations? How do you get the information you need from the analysts who are doing the work?
Yeah, so critically important. I will say there's three primary mechanisms when you look at the risk elements overall, as opposed to, obviously, I get a daily threat briefing, as you might expect in this environment, and that can be very short, verbal to detailed written product, because this is an ongoing concern or something we need to communicate to our stakeholders, and therefore I'm seeing it because our stakeholders are going to be seeing it. In terms of risk elements, when we complete a specific set, so say we just completed our testing results, I get the results of the test, and that's usually both a presentation and a hard write-up. If you look at the overall risk element, that is a much more complex set of usually presentation slides. I don't, at this level, rarely get to play with the spreadsheets myself. Not that I don't occasionally want to see what the formulas are, but as a general rule, mm-hmm. that it's set, and then I will ask serious questions.
So do you have any sort of tips or advice for how people can sort of effectively
Yes.
get you the information you need, such that you're not sort of overwhelmed, or like what is the best way for them to get you what you need?
Yeah, so the biggest thing I tell people is let the data lead you. Don't start out with an assumption and then fit your data, right? So biggest concern out there is you start in a certain way and you let your self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That's not to say when you go to present, you should be able to say, based on the analysis, the top three things are.
Okay.
Right? And then I will go in and I will explain the detail behind it. I will tell people that, given my training as a lawyer, I will read 50 pages. I will tell them, but you will be sorry if I read 50 pages because I will ask you about footnote on page 24. So better for you if you give me a 5-page that's dense, good, quality content, and then we have a conversation back and forth.
Thank you.
Doria.
Julia Fidani, REI Systems. Thank you also for a really insightful presentation. My question is, to what extent do you need to depend on either foreign governments or private partners like airlines for some of the data that you are assessing in terms of reviewing threats? And how much confidence then do you have in that data integrity and the data that they're providing you? And secondly, I wanted to follow up just because I found it curious that you said you don't have to be at 100%, because
Nobody hears that ever.
right, my understanding is that, oh, it's the one thing that we didn't think about that then became problematic. So if you could address those things.
Yep. Extremely reliant on data provided by other entities. So just as an example, we do regular compliance reviews and visits where we go to last points of departure who have flights coming to the United States. We are not there every day. We don't own or operate their system. They know we're coming when we're there. So obviously we're going to get the best result while we're on the ground for our compliance review. So we are incredibly reliant on both what they tell us directly when they see something that's going wrong, changes and measures they're making, and our best partners, we have this conversation. We're also incredibly reliant, for example, on an airline who reports to us if they see something wrong at an airport they're visiting. In addition, we work incredibly closely just with the air carriers. If you think about trying to project how many people are going to show up, not over a season, not just at one airport, but I need to know hour by hour at every checkpoint how many people are going to be coming. That means we have to have manifest flight, how many flights are you having, what projection do you for how sold out you are, months in advance so I can hire the staff and have them ready, right? This isn't something I can know 72 hours out when we start actually getting the manifest data. So incredibly, incredibly reliant on the industry working together as a whole against this problem set. To your second question, I'm sorry, I forgot.
It was, one, if you could talk about the data integrity.
Yes.
The aspect of those entities then providing you with that data.
Yes. So overall data integrity is very important, but if you look at data in the aggregate, you can decide where you can accept less than perfect, right? Because nothing's ever going to be perfect. I don't actually need to know on any given day that it's 2.1653 million people showing up. 2.15 is probably good enough, right? I got it from there. So, if we're off by 100,000 system-wide, it's not a big deal, weirdly enough, right? Critically important, flip side, to know if someone sees an ongoing day in, day out problem at an airport that is not being remedied, right? And so that one report, I need to be fast and accurate. And then I think you had a follow-on last piece.
It was 100%.
Yes. So inherently people like the idea of, shouldn't we always be at 100%? Why shouldn't we always? And if the answer is you're totally and only testing. So think about, I've been trying to come up with good analogies. I'm always out there on the hunt for good analogies. So you just completed a graduate level course in the topic that is going to be the subject of your dissertation. And you're taking the test at the end of the semester. And then you're asked to take a test which is undergraduate level. You should do really well on that, right? Like pretty close to 100. Flip that. You're taking a test on a problem you've never seen before, never had a class on. How well are you going to do? Yeah. Or compare and contrast to Food and Drug Administration. When they do drug trials, do they look for 100% effectiveness with no side effects? No. It's better than not to have it, right? So when we look at mitigation measures, as an example, I need to know that the mitigation I have is cost effective, meaning I am better to have it than I am without it, but I don't need it to be 100% effective against every single threat. And then overall, I recognize my system. If we had one, silver bullet, nobody ever gets past X, that would be great, but that's not the world we live in. So instead, we design our system with a series of processes with the idea that it's a lot more work to get through 7 right? And overall, I have a measure of effectiveness rather than just this single point and hope it's 100%.
Patty, one of the things that came out in our analytics survey is, surprise, surprise, the folks who do the analytics think it's underfunded, think there should be more analytics. And it's interesting because we kind of thought it's a situation where it's really hard to be precise and say, here's how much money you should spend. And again, to persuade that lay audience, this is the right amount of analytics investment. So can you tell us a little bit about how at TSA you decide, how much to spend on measuring or testing or evaluating or gathering the data?
Yes.
How do you make that decision?
All right, so here's another one that I'm going to say, following on your point of nothing needs to be 100%. I also don't need 100% of data to make a decision, right? I need the right type of data, but I really only need 70% of the data to make a informed decision that's most likely going to be correct. And if I wait till I've actually analyzed to the 100% degree, gotten every single data element that matters, I'm going to take a lot of time to get there. And it would be better to be quicker and act on a 70% solution. Now, the flip side is making sure you got the right 70% of the data. So the most important conversation I have with is understanding what's readily accessible, that we can analyze quickly, what's missing that would be hugely valuable in deciding whether or not to go forward with this. What do I need in order to fill that part of the gap? And so someone who tells me, I can get to this, this, and this, but I really can't get to this, it's helpful when they can describe for me what I'm actually missing, because that tells me whether or not I should invest in it. I would say, and I'll actually use an example since I have my HSI friend here. One example of how much time do you spend on something that we used to do in Homeland Security investigations on the analytics side was analysis that we would look to share with foreign partners about trends in trade data. The ability to understand kind of where we were seeing money laundering, where we were seeing fraudulent transactions, to be able to share with the host country. Great door opener, always good conversations, but it would take each of my analysts about a month to produce one report. And I was like, I don't know that this is the right use of our time. And if I go tell the person who is receiving the report that it's taking a month to go, and instead I could have them write 5 reports in that same time frame of different types, would they be just as happy? Yeah, they would. So let's not do this anymore. And that's the important conversation.
Okay. Sir?
Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Buchanan, mostly retired, was at Homeland Security, built the National Operations Center and Homeland Security Information Network and Common Operating Picture. In that time frame, we were able to get lots of data, but we had trouble processing it all. We used 150 people to able to correlate and assimilate the data. So my first question is, are you using big data, non-SQL processing in order to help do some of the analytics now?
We do have quite a shop that continually looks at both what do we need in order to do certain things in a much more automated way, and then a whole bunch of stuff where we just haven't decided that it was worth spending the money in order to do those activities, because the requirement and need keeps changing as we learn more. I'll use as an example, Common Operating Picture. This has been something we've talked about my entire time at Homeland Security. Shouldn't we have a single Common Operating Picture? I've really come to the conclusion, I don't believe we should. I don't actually think at that level you're actually telling anyone other than the Secretary and Deputy Secretary something meaningful. And you can spend 150 people full out, 24/7, and really serve 2 customers. And instead you can say, what is the problem I am trying to communicate about? Design something much more targeted with many fewer resources and actually service more customers. So what is it you're trying to do? We have obviously a very sizable investment directly with FAA, the Department of Defense, a few others, looking at airspace, right? How do we know what's in the airspace? Do we have a single Common Operating Picture? No, but that's okay. That we have 3 different pictures at any given time. They're each telling me something very different, and that's why they're important. And so you have smart people who look at this data, who are educated consumers, who know why each one's important.
Other question was, have you been able to factor in the cultural aspects of the adversaries and the threats?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we're understanding our threats and the likelihood of where it's going to potentially manifest itself, right? Obviously the big one that we've all been talking about for an extended period of time now is the full switch we have seen. Not that terrorists aren't still interested in a big bring down an airplane, because they are, but at the same time, if the answer is I don't think I can get through security, I will just come and use several weapons and look to do as much damage as I can in the car park or the open queue area, right? Understanding that shift in mindset and mentality meant we completely changed up a lot of our protocols and procedures with all of our transportation security partners about what protection means, right? It's not just I don't want to get something on a plane, although I really don't want something getting on a plane. I really need to think more broadly. Why is it critically important for somebody to say, there's a car sitting in the employee parking lot that's got wires sticking out of it, right? So what do I need to educate, and who do I need to educate, and how do I get more people feeling like they are part of the security culture, and that it's okay to say there's an insider threat problem in transportation, that I am not saying that you're a bad person just because I am making you go through some extra stuff, right? That you are part of the security culture and you should want us to have a security culture, even if that means you are personally inconvenienced employee X at the airport by having to go through additional measures. So hugely valuable to take that information and then turn it into action.
Glenn?
Great. Glenn Hersey, thank you both for being, all three of you, sorry, for being here. I had a question about changes in DHS in general's data-driven decision-making and data pipelines. About maybe like 9 years ago, I worked under another agency, worked with Donna Roy, and we're talking NEAM, we're going to classes for the information sharing environment, then we're going to interagency country working groups, and there was MOUs, and it seemed like there's a lot of work that need to be done, but I'm hoping this time and age, it's not just paperwork and meetings and meetings and meetings, but more identifying what guardrails need to be put in place and then sharing that data. So can you speak a little bit about data ops and how you are putting it together policies, processes, and technologies, and allowing data engineers to just go work on solving the solution, solving the problem?
Fantastic question. And inherently this goes to how you talk about what you do with both inside constituencies and external constituencies, right? So first, just have to say, I don't know if you caught up with Donna recently, she switched jobs, which I'm very excited for her. But incredibly important role, as was pointed out, in putting together the National Information Exchange model, which is common language basically to be able to share data across systems. Well, the piece that goes along with this is, people always want to say is, can I not do an MOU? Can I not do 6 steps? Can I not do, right? And I think the problem we have historically struggled with is, how do I make sure that I am retaining all of the reasons, rights, responsibility associated with why I collected this through the system? So it's great that I can now have systems talk to each other and I don't have to constantly be moving things from one system to another. But if it doesn't retain as it goes back all of that stuff with it, there's a potential that suddenly information could be used for a purpose that wasn't what you intended or expected. So the number one thing I like to talk about is, rather than trying to say we're going to set up this, and I'm just going to say this slightly pejoratively for 2 seconds. I get a lot of vendors who come to me and go, hey, if you just stick all of the data in one big data lake, all of your problems will be solved. And I'm like, then you're not writing for my world. I need it to be able to live in the system in which it was collected with the rationale and responsibility and reasons it went with. I need a way to go across it that keeps the integrity of that wrapper, that policy wrapper with it. And the best way to do that, the easiest way to do that, is to have very clear use cases. What problem am I solving? why is this information related to the problem I'm solving? I then have a common architecture who can service a bunch of different problems. But me, why do I see X, is related to my job, my role, my responsibility, and I retain or don't retain underlying access based on that being implemented in a certain way. I will say this is an area that is incredibly difficult to organize right across the federal government. I think the biggest place we have made the most strides in this is with respect to the National Vetting Center. So, fundamentally having that kind of dedication and focus around ensuring preservation of that sort of model mindset, critically important, and especially when you're talking about unclassified, to classified and back again.
Thank you.
Let me ask Patty, one of the other pieces of our survey that I found quite interesting was we asked each survey respondent, what do you think are the most promising types of analytic techniques for improving government in the future? And the answer, far more than anything else, 26% said either machine learning or artificial intelligence. And then we kind of subtly combined that with our understanding of another question response, which was, are you using this analytics technique in your job? And less than 4% of the people said they're using AI. So everybody likes the idea, but nobody's actually doing it. And so my question is TSA getting some value from AI? Is it, how do you compare the judgment? And I always think of the Israeli example, the Israeli kind of behavioral character assessment of the person who presents himself to you at the check-in counter and the terminal, and they aren't looking necessarily for a weapon. What they're looking for is behaviors. And that's something that strikes me that would be very hard to do with AI. But what if anything, is TSA thinking about AI? Are you making a big investment in it or not? And does that have lessons for any other agencies?
So I will say that this is another one, perfect, right, a follow-on is, what is your use case? Do you have the right data set to inform your use case? And then how do you set it up from there, right? Because, there's fantastic examples of where AI works really well and examples of where AI goes really wrong. I chalk that up to, you didn't understand your data set or you asked the wrong question, but there's other stuff in there. I will say the biggest places that are easy for us are less on the example you gave, but more on the where are we data rich and it's a repeatable task that you think you could clearly articulate a problem. So, number one that we have out and about right now, we look at a lot of X-ray imagery. A lot of X-ray imagery. Really, really, really would like to get to the point where the vast majority of prohibited items are just automatically detected by the machine rather than the person. The person can be trained on what's the new thing, the new piece of intelligence that hasn't made it into the algorithm yet. But the fact that I can always find a gun or parts of a gun, because it doesn't need to be fully assembled, right? I can see certain types of materials in contrast to others. What am I looking for, and how do I get a machine really good at that? How do I do that across the entire set of machines I have? There are certain places we do that today. We are looking for the next generation of that. We need to do a much better job about connecting up our data sets. The other place that goes kind of in a similar vein is CCTV footage. And this is an area where, again, I have to be super careful about how I talk about this and how I describe it, because the first thing that comes up in the context in a lot of conversations these days is, oh, that means you're matching against watch list random people on the street. I'm like, yeah, no, that's not my job. My job is, why is there a bag that's been sitting on a train platform by itself unattended for 10 minutes? Why is there a person who's let 5 trains go by standing really close to the tracks? Is he gonna jump in front of a train? How do I get that kind of queuing and tipping information to law enforcement so that they don't have to have X number of people constantly watching the CCTV footage all the time, but it's the right type of things that should automatically result in some kind of law enforcement response just to go look at what that is, right? So how do you find those types of problems? At airports, there are, every time there's a door going from the non-secured area to the secured area, you better believe we got a camera seeing who's going through those doors. If we see someone piggyback on somebody else or someone not badge, we want an immediate, what were you doing? And they're probably gonna get fined, like immediately, everyone. That's the goal, right? Nobody should be exempt. So things like that, would like to be in a better place to be able to use that information.
So if I were to generalize that for other agencies, it sounds like what you're saying is look for stuff that's really labor intensive and perhaps repetitive, and
Yep.
then try and apply AI to that.
And a lot of instances of it. If you're trying to find something that happens once in a blue moon, you can't train the AI.
Yeah, yeah.
If it happens a lot, you got a lot of data.
Okay.
So does that technology exist? So there's facial,
Yeah.
there's like recognition technology.
Yeah.
Does sort of that, I don't know what you call it, like behavior recognition technology exist?
Yeah, so this is a great conversation we're having right now, trying to get at what's out there in the market space. We are going through a series of kind of innovation efforts to understand, not just in the security space, but who's looking at things that might go to some of these problem sets.
Okay.
So I will say I've talked to 1 or 2 entities who do this kind of stuff. Results aren't
Okay.
everywhere you would like it to be. So
Yeah.
then the next part is how do we use our convening authority, use our kind of power of the ability to drive a market to help advance some of these technologies. Because frankly, the rest of the world is looking to us to get a lot of this right. And so we can sort of push things in a certain way, and it really drives markets.
See your question back here?
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Anna Gorniak. I'm a developer at IBM. So we are working with TSA and some of the technology, but my main question goes to AI ethics. How do you see actually machine learning algorithm being trained within TSA, right? And those people who are training affecting not only having access not only to private information of passengers, air flights and all of that, but actually biometrics information of certain people.
Yes. So critically important, again, my job is incredibly public facing, right? My job is I need to both explain it internally and externally, which means we don't have instances where someone just goes, oh, let me figure out what I can do with this data and see where it goes. I define a very clear use case. I put clear guardrails around it. We write public-facing privacy impact assessments, and then we enforce those rules internally. So biometrics is a great example. A lot of confusion and misunderstanding out there in this space today about what, for example, we and CBP are doing compared to various municipalities who are looking at it as a law enforcement context, right? Critically important in a law enforcement context, if you have someone who says there was just a burglary in X, and I've got CCTV footage of the perpetrator from the starting point, to then be able to say, can I find them as they leave the scene? And I'm willing to have a fuzzier match on what that looks like because I'm tracking and trailing a suspect. Yeah? For me, when somebody's walking up to a checkpoint, I don't need to match them against watch lists. I don't need to match, I'm looking for them, right? I want to know that you match your passport photo. So I want a very tight match. I don't need to do or want to do 1 to 250 million. I want to do 1 to small because I want a high likelihood it's you because I'm relying on that to speed up a process. So critically important, back again to what's the use case, what's the problem set, and then both how do I make sure I'm living it, but also how do I explain it to people what it is.
That seems like it could be automated, right? Like you would put your passport photo in and look at a screen and yeah.
So,
And that would put a lot of people out of a job, but yeah.
I'll spend 2 minutes talking about this. This is the biggest conversation we've been having recently. Okay, just think about for a minute the types of future state you could have.
Okay.
You're highlighting what a lot of European, New Zealand, Australia, a couple other countries are doing is like e-gates, which is you put your passport in, it reads, it does a match to your passport, and then the gate opens.
Okay.
Right? We're looking at it slightly differently. Number one, because my joking rule of thumb is every time you drill something into the ground at a checkpoint, 2 years later you're really sorry you put that much drilled into the ground because you need to move it. So you're going to spend a lot of money physically moving all that stuff, including the power and the connectivity. So what's my lighter footprint? How about this? I am not saying this is what's going to happen, but just try to create, right? At home, you are checking in for your flight as you do today on your phone, right? You put in, yeah, I would like to travel on my passport today, we already have the passport photo at DHS because every passport photo is with CBP. You put in your number because you're saying, I want to use my passport today, right? You finish your check-in and you say, yes, I want to sign up for the automated process. As you get to the airport, it says, hi, I see you have reached airport grounds. Your appointment for screening is at 1:35. So don't go stand in line for 20 minutes. You have an appointment. 3, as you're walking up to the screening checkpoint, there's a camera that takes a picture of you. And by the time you get up to the screening checkpoint, appearing on the screen in front of the officer is your photo, which is matched against the database, your flight information, and your screening results. So you didn't need to present me a document, and you didn't need to present me a boarding pass. And that means, yep, you're going to lane 3. And that officer's job is to make sure you're going the right place based on the analysis of the screening results, as opposed to today where they spend a lot of time trying to figure out if your document's fragile. Right? This piece repeats, and I don't know if how many of you have traveled internationally recently? Yeah. So CBP's got a great project going on right now looking at how they use biometrics. My last trip, it was fantastic. I literally, instead of the old way where you had to show your passport to the flight attendant and they scanned your boarding pass, you literally walk up, it took a picture, green light, go. They can board, the big A380s 30 minutes faster this way. Which is why the airlines are investing in this. But they're bouncing and matching against the CBP holdings of your passport data, right? So we want one seamless airport environment, right? But yes, all of the annoying paper bits, we could, for people who want to opt in, make it much simpler. You shouldn't have to have a piece of paper that's your boarding pass or on your phone. You shouldn't have to show a document if you're registered with us. If you don't want to register with us, that's okay too. We'll always read your document. We'd like to do it in a less onerous, less manual way, but you don't have to register with us.
So you might have answered my question just now, but let me double check, which is again, the analytics survey said the most significant use of time by people who are government analytics professionals is gathering data. And so my question is, even given the number of ways TSA may be much more advanced than other government agencies, are there either things that, if you got more funding from Congress and you got your wish list, you would automate gathering of data type X and you would do it in using method Y? And especially given perhaps that a lot of the data you rely on maybe is gathered by people who are not you. They're gathered by, whether it be airlines or whether it be airports or what have you. What do you see as kind of the next frontier of improving, reducing the effort or the burden of data gathering?
So inherently, stepping outside my TSA only hat for a moment, but I'll use a TSA problem set to illustrate the problem. Is if they're kind of going on the NEAM mindset and methodology, but also a way to protect data in transit and make it so that systems can be sufficiently responsive. So I know this comes as a complete shock to you, but Congress is all continually looking for different ways to help us be more efficient. So,
Or is it to spend less money?
One of the ways is they have liked to identify who they think are lower risk passengers and suggest to us in really strong terms why they think they should be members of TSA PreCheck. Which sounds great, right up until you figure out how to implement it. And then you have to go have a chat with them about what that looks like. So, who do you think are some of probably the least risky populations we might have in the United States?
People over 80.
And kids, yeah. Yeah, right.
Law enforcement. Right? They all had some kind of clearance. Mostly we let them travel armed anyway. Why can't they be in PreCheck? How many law enforcement agencies do we have in this country?
Thousands.
15,000. How the heck do I figure out if you're from one of the 15,000 agencies in this country and keep that list up to date without compiling one central repository? And nobody would want us to do that. Right. So if I could have my magic wish, it's leave data where it is, but make it much easier to intersect and interact across these seams in a secure, protected way. I still don't know how I would cut agreements with 15,000 agencies. Maybe, would do it through another methodology. This is why things like NLETs exist, right, in order to be able to interact across law enforcement agencies. But finding ways to let data sit where it needs to sit and then interact at the time you need it is critically important, rather than having to move it over and then analyze it after it's stale. Right?
So that's our 15-minute warning. So we've got about another 10 minutes worth of conversation, and then we'll need to wrap up. I saw there's a question back.
Yeah. So much of what TSA does seems to revolve around data analysis, exploitation, data sharing, and also it's most essentially communicating the data internally and externally. How do you develop that kind of data acumen within your organization and acquire and retain talent so that you're able to do that and effectively communicate to leaders and to Congress and others about the data that you have and the risk that you have in your data?
The age-old question. So I'm going to start with the first start part is that how do you create a workforce that thinks about how do I ask a good question? How do I figure out what data sources are available? How do I understand the results that are out there? And I will say, not every organization has a culture that builds and enforces this, right? Some of it, and from my perspective, the number one thing I can do in my position is be clear about what data I am using and how I'm using it in decision making. If I make it clear that someone can't just come tell me, sky is falling, have to do something, here's the one thing, sign, right? That's not going to work. That I need to have a structured process that results in, I'm investing in these 5 things for this reason. That's my number one way to push culture down. Number 2 is really around things like investing in the testing regimes that we have, investing in our risk analytics. We did a reorganization recently where we integrated our risk team into the folks who analyze the operational risk and the risk associated with the various parts of our system into the same group who does our requirements and capabilities. So the risks immediately feed into what am I investing in next, both in terms of prioritization and of the 5 things in this space, this is the part that needs most attention. I will say, the next part on the communicating, right? We spend a lot of time talking to the various entities who serve as our oversight to look to get them more educated on how we take on this problem set. Because you're right, inherently, and part of the reason I started the conversation that I did where I did was, the first conversation I have with a brand new member of Congress is, so the last time I was flying through Airport X, I saw, right? And I need to get them to be an educated consumer and customer of us in a different way, as an example. Similarly, when I meet a brand new Inspector General, I want to do absolutely everything I can to help them understand this is how we look across, so that they aren't just looking at the analysis from their last audit team that did this slice, right? I need them to understand context, perspective, overall programs, methodology, mindset, and approach.
Ashley, was there a question?
Yep, we had 2 live stream questions come in. The first one was use cases. Do you have a repository with all use cases?
So what we do is we have an...
Repeat the question because the camera may not hear.
The question was, do we have a repository of use cases? And say, we have a couple different ways we describe this, right? So there's the use case in a traditional way of looking at information for information sharing purposes, and absolutely we have to have those. So just as an example of where you can see some of that, if you ever read one of our privacy impact assessments, it goes through pretty clearly what the use case are, what are the risks associated, how do I mitigate those, things like that. The other piece that we look at that's similarly but not quite the same is a description of what a threat or vulnerability is. So it's kind of the reverse of a use case, right? It's my threat case. And that's a description of what's it based on, where did it come from, and that is all documented.
Second is, how do you identify emerging threats or risks and then collect the right data?
Haha, yes. So how do we identify emerging threat or risks, and how do we collect the right data? So I will say we are incredibly indebted to good intelligence information. This can be from the intelligence community per se, looking at a direct terrorist relationship. It can be, aviation workers reporting something that they see in their environment. It can be analysis and trends in collaboration with foreign partners. How often are you seeing X or Y? Some of it is also being able to understand what the data is telling me. So I'll just go back to this again. For years and years, there was a pretty big kind of dichotomy within kind of our world of, am I looking for threats that bring down a plane, right? So I'm looking at weapons, bombs, right? Am I looking at drugs? Guess how many times CBP finds drugs in the transportation system a day? Yeah, a lot. Guess how many times I find bombs? Not much, right? Which is good. But what does this also tell me? If someone can move drugs because they've got insiders helping them, those are also the vulnerabilities I need to figure out how to close. So I can bring these work streams together. So it's not just the stuff, it's the method and mode it's moving.
Let me ask you a question, Patty, about kind of something that TSA I think has experience with that would be really of strong interest to some other parts of government. And the question will be essentially, what are the mechanics of how someone who doesn't work for you, let's say they're an employee of an airport or a contractor, how do they kind of say, hey, I noticed this and get that to TSA? And the reason I'm interested is because about 20% of government's work is done through grants. And so an agency, let's say the Department of Labor or EPA, similarly, they grant money to a city or a county or even a private company or a nonprofit, and they'd really like to get kind of information back, maybe really timely, maybe time isn't so important, but they'd like to get good information back reliably from those people who are not their employees. So how do the mechanics work at TSA, and are any of those kind of applicable to other government agencies?
So lots going on in that question. I think there's a couple different ways that we look to get information. So I'm going to start with some threat information and vulnerability information and move into the how's my program working type of discussion, right? So the first part on the threat and vulnerability, we have stood long-standing what's called our Aviation Domain Intelligence Advisory Committee process, ADAC. Long-standing process, and we also have an Aviation Security Advisory Committee. Critically important, we have cleared people who on a regular basis, like daily, get a classified briefing from us. They know what we're looking for. They see a different part of the spectrum or sphere. They are immediately able to tell us things that are happening in their world that we wouldn't otherwise see because they know what we're looking for and why we care about it.
Now, is that like an airport director's part of that, or is that like kind of a security agent or an airplane, an airline gate counter agent?
So the ASAC, the advisory committee, tends to be the heads of organizations. The intel side tends to be the security focus. Okay. Yeah. Just because who wants to go through the hassle of carrying a clearance in part, I think. Critically important. We've got similar process underway for the surface side. We have a lot of exchange at the unclassified level in that space, moving into more of a rigorous, structured, classified process. Separate part is how we look at ongoing feedback about how programs work. So unlike a lot of other agencies, we have a very different kind of regulatory scheme than most places use. So from my prior work, the answer was if I wanted to make a change to a immigration or customs program, I write a regulation, it goes through a proposed rule, I get public feedback back, I then have to analyze all the feedback, I write the response, I publish a final. Best case, I think the fastest one I ever did was 18 months. 3 to 7 years is normal. Not fast. And the comments you get back are from really uninformed to very informed. Right. Our environment, we set up a security program, and then we have a regulated entity. Right? So I have an overall structure that says, for how we regulate airports, these are the elements that you, in general, must be done, and then I am going to execute an airport security plan with each and every airport that we regulate. I can change the airport security plan with them very quickly. And I can make wholesale changes across through a special authority we have, which are called security directives. We have a security directives for domestic, emergency amendments for foreign, where we need a change made immediately. Those don't go through traditional notice and comment. But Because at the end of the day, back to that earlier conversation of I want it to be something they can execute. We do even these things that don't require full notice and comment. We like to do them in consultation because they will tell us, well, if I did that, not only would it cost this much money, but I don't think I'm going to get the result you were looking for. And we'll have a big back and forth about exactly how to do it, where to do it, how to do it with the best result. And sometimes that takes a little bit longer than sometimes you'd like, but it's a much more formed answer on the other end.
Yeah.
And then we go through it periodically where they can actually ask what's called for an alternate procedure, where they can come back to us and say, you know this thing you told me to do? I want to do this, which doesn't look like what you told me to, but I think it gets me at the same outcome. Will you approve me to do it and relieve this measure?
Cool. We have time for maybe one more question. Any other questions? One more from online.
On TSA's innovation efforts to better understand the screening technology marketplace, what is your process, and is there a timeline for acquiring certain technologies? What requirements must be met?
All right.
Loaded one.
So the one that's open, I believe right now, that I would like to make sure people know about is we're doing what's called a broad agency announcement. So right now we have out, and if it's on FedBiz Ops, because that's the way government does things, but we have links to it from our Innovation Task Force webpage as well, I believe, that describe a series of problem sets that we are currently looking for ideas around. And there's a window for someone to write a proposal to put in through that process. If you put in through that process, we then go through an initial review, a down select, a certain number of people, entities will get funding to do a demonstration out of it. Or if it's far enough along, we'll turn it right into, we could move past a demonstration. We're doing other engagements though, because we're looking at common problem sets where somebody else has a similar problem set to see where can we do this together. An example of one where we did a BAA, but we are working very closely with somebody else is wait times at airports. Yes, everybody wants to know how long the security checkpoint is, but really what they want to know is from the time I arrive on airport property and have to get parking all the way to the gate, how much time do I need? So if I can set a standard for how I'm measuring my part of the wait time, and the airport wants to pick a technology that's going to do across the whole thing, I'm good, right? So it's how do I describe the problem sets and then work with other affected entities. So it's not always us. In fact, if you look at back again to my earlier point of, except for the checkpoint, we don't own and operate equipment. So if you want to do something with New Jersey Transit, other than grant dollars, we can be convening, we can set standards, we qualify products. We have an ongoing process by which someone can identify a piece of equipment and go through a qualification standard, and we'll then put it on a list so that anybody can buy it, because we'll say this meets the standard. But we are not going to be the ones buying it.
Let me ask one last question. We have REI Systems essentially kind of both delivers software using agile development methodologies, and we decided we're going to run our own company on an agile basis so we can kind of shift quickly. It strikes me that TSA actually is pretty quick to react and to kind of address things like when a threat environment changes.
Thank you for saying
Is
that.
there a kind of a management approach that you all use that kind of helps ensure that agility?
So I think inherently it's part of our DNA and culture given how the agency was born. So the biggest thing was how do you go from, when TSA stood up, the joke was we had to open more airport locations than McDonald's had in under a year, right? And then we had to make a concerted effort to kind of upgrade the game, because why was the federal government taking this over, right? So part of it was you started out with a series of people who just wanted to be there because they wanted to work on this very hard problem, who started out literally showing up at airports and their desk was 2 boxes stacked on each other and the pad of paper they picked up at Staples on the way to work. The incredible starting attitude of our people, because that's what they were born from. What you need to do then is mature enough into processes that support the creativity and the responsiveness, but provide the right data and structure. So you can't get so bureaucratic you lose the ingenuity. You can't be so out of the box that you have no repeatable process, and making sure you get those right and keep them right. So I think that's an ongoing, you gotta continue to watch out for it and make sure that as you're doing things, you're not overly incentivizing or disincentivizing.
Good. All right, well, please join me in thanking Patty Cogswell for joining us and sharing her perspective on both TSA and analytics. It's been a wonderful discussion.